So everybody who's here, thanks for joining Diversity Factors D&I online lab talk on allyship. For those of you who do not know us, Diversity Factor is a management consulting firm focused solely on diversity and inclusion. So basically, we try to help our clients with creating inclusive environments where diversity thrives. Somebody created that tagline a long time ago, and I still love it because it's more about inclusion than diversity as such. Our online lab talk is part of our D&I Lab community, where a lot of D&I professionals, I have to say D&I ladies, because most of them are women still working within this field, come together and share knowledge and share learning about what are the challenges and what are the success stories, what are the pain points of working with diversity and inclusion in an organization, whether big or small. And they have requested when they co-created the lab schedule for 21 and 22 that we had a discussion around allyship. And that is also why we reached out to Thandi to come join us here on this online talk to dive deeper into the subject and the terminology behind allyship, and also very practical, how to actually practice it, and maybe have a bit of a discussion around why allyship is the biggest word out there, but no one is actually doing it. Okay, so that's my point of view. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Helene. I'm the CEO of Diversity Factor. I am also joined on this call by people who actually make this company work, and the shoulders of the giants of which I stand upon, Jessica and Veronica and Natalia, who is also on this call. Okay, let's go. Thandi, thank you for joining us on this online talk on allyship. Thandi, could you please introduce yourself to everybody on this call? Who is Thandi?
Thank you so much, Helene, and thank you all for being here. I'm super happy that we're having this conversation today. My name is Thandi Dyani. I am Danish South African. I now live in Copenhagen. I'm a consulting network catalyst for Africa region and the Nordics with the BMW Foundation, where I work to inspire responsible leadership and aligned with the SDGs. I'm also fiercely passionate about gender and racial equity, and I work with different organizations on justice, equity, diversity, and belonging or inclusion as advisor. And I try to kind of help organizations who want to start their journeys for society to become better for all. I co-founded 2 initiatives. One is the Gender Alliance, where we work broadly with accelerating gender equality on a global scale, as well as the Unlearning Journey, which is it's kind of a platform for racial equity, where we create awareness around the topic, around race and racial equity, and we write articles as well as facilitate conversations and workshops around the subject. I also do keynotes and panels on these topics, intersecting, for example, with entrepreneurship or philanthropy, investment, leadership, organizational development, and I design and facilitate spaces and workshops and talks where we can kind of host these conversations around this leadership challenge. Other than that, I've also been a DJ for 25 years, and I'm a firm believer that arts and culture, especially music, has this enormous power to be a catalyst for the change we want to see.
Exactly.
So for me, it's super great to see some momentum for this topic around DEI and justice and allyship. And with less than a decade to reach the SDGs, I think we really must acknowledge that inequality and discrimination are at the root of many of these global challenges that we face. So that's just a little about me.
Thank you, Thandi. Lovely that you're here. And I think that you and I can agree that we agree on a lot of things about this. Now, we decided not to do slides, Thandi and I, because as you both know, we work both as a consultant. So slides, it's part of our everyday life. So this is also a very informal, hopefully also very safe talk. But hopefully we're also going to challenge you a bit during this. So yes, we're going to try to reach those SDGs on number 5 and number 10 There's a lot of work to be done. Need some and some tempo in order to achieve this. And allyship, I think, is one of the biggest buzzwords I hear around diversity and equity and inclusion work currently, and it has been for some years now. And we have been talking about allyship in Diversity Factor ourselves for a long time, not just around me and Veronica, Natalia and Jessica, but also with our clients and so forth, and had hosted workshop on allyship. But what I often found that it is a big buzzword, but what does it actually mean? So I'm reaching it over to you, and I'm gonna let you explain what allyship is. So Thandi, in practical terms, what is allyship?
Well, I think to start out, I think we need to kind of establish allyship is it's not a noun, it's a verb. It's something we do, it's actions. It's really about becoming to do actionable things. And I think allyship is kind of a contemporary social justice term. And some people really say it's an activist term, but I really don't like that, because it shouldn't just be in an activist space. We should all become allies in our spheres of influence. But it's about describing efforts by members of a privileged group to advantage the interest and access equity of marginalized or oppressed groups, both in society at large, but also in particular social contexts, and that could be our workplaces. Yeah. So it's about speaking up, learning, listening, I would say listening again, and really kind of be intentional towards helping and creating equity for marginalized groups.
When you say marginalized groups, who are marginalized groups? Because that's also something that we talk a lot about. Marginalized groups, marginalized communities, minorities, and so forth. We sometimes say that allyship is taking on the struggle of the minorities as one's own, if you're a majority, part of the majority. But let's try to maybe get those two terms then. What is a minority or a marginalized group, and what is a majority and a privileged group?
So I think we could probably host a whole lab on minoritized people and really get into the subject of white supremacy and systems of oppression, which is a historical kind of unraveling stuff. But marginalized groups are people, or people with identifying markers, such as myself. I'm a woman of color. I'm non-skinny. I have refugee background. So there's a lot of kind of identities that are marginalized compared to the in-group, say in Denmark, where the majority is white and the job market is for, white males or whatever it might be. So it's basically where there are systemic differences between two groups or identities.
And those shifts, right? Because we can have one majority in Denmark, but that maybe look different in Germany or in the US, or in Middle East, or in Asia. We work with a lot of global clients. So mapping out the majority, you can't just always say, yeah, it's the white dudes, so to speak, and the marginalized groups is this, because it again goes back to the context and the socialization that you're in. You agree with that?
Yeah, it is. Yes, completely. It's very much locally based in the context that you're in, for example, in this room where, in that workplace that you're operating. So you always have to navigate these different kind of systems that you are in, and it's complex. Yeah.
So how do you actually do? So you say yourself, you're a woman in leadership positions in Denmark. That is a minority or a marginalized group. You're a woman of color. That's even more marginalized groups, especially in Denmark. As you say, you have a refugee background, aka I'm not skinny either, so I get it. And we do put status into just a simple thing as body size, and we hold skinnier, especially women, to a higher standard, or not a higher standard, but we give them more pride and more status in society than we do with those who are not skinny. I don't know if the Kim Kardashians or the whole Kardashians tribe is actually changing that right now, along with Beyonce. But again, that's a whole other discussion around how Black culture is moving into to the majority of white culture. But what I was going back to is, how do you then feel it in practice as maybe a part of some marginalized groups? How do you how do you see true allyship? You personally, how do you feel it if it is in practice actually portrayed?
Yeah. So I think for me, it's very much around, for example, let's take a very kind of normal example that we all I think experience, that you're sitting in a meeting, you're getting talked over and nobody is saying anything, or somebody is kind of being credited for your results and nobody is speaking up for you. So it's very much about the one, let's say your boss or the man in the room kind of takes charge and say, hey, let's listen to Thandi instead of listening to the people that we always listen to and hear what she has to say. Let's put the credit where credit's due. But also, so it's I think it's very much when people create agency, using their position to create agency for others. And it's not, I mean, for me, I also carry privileges when I'm, for example, working in South Africa, having a half European background, having a degree from a European university. So what I can do then is use my position of power to help others, opening the doors for others. Because I think in reality, we all need to think of ourselves as gatekeepers for someone. Yeah. So even though that I'm maybe a minority or an oppressed group in some context, I will be the position holding the power or wielding the power, having to use that power to open the doors for others in other contexts. Yeah. So it's always about navigating these different complex systems.
And I think that's really, really interesting, because oftentimes we have this view of allyship as it's something that is very static. So it's something where you either have to represent towards people of color or members of the LGBT community or people with mental or physical disabilities, but knowing that actually you also have privileges if it moves around, if you move in a context, and that also then allows you, even though in some groups you're part of a marginalized community or group, then sometimes you're also the majority. How do we navigate that complexity? Actually, how do you navigate on a personal level? Because I think it too. Sometimes I have a lot of privilege, and how do I give out the microphone? And then another times I'm like, could somebody please help me?
Yeah. No, I think it's about, I mean, actually this space you created here, it's a very important step to, bounce off your ideas or talk about this subject, because it's constantly moving. And like you say, it's really about navigating complexity. And we can't do that by ourselves. We need, we need accountability partners. We need allyship partners. We need to move in a herd, And I think it's about constantly, challenging our own biases and constantly putting ourselves, in the middle of this, if you can imagine this round wheel of intersectional privileges, if you're a man or a woman, or if you're, your race or your background or your civil status, if you're a refugee, if you're a normal citizen, all of these things, how do you constantly look at yourself in this wheel of different privileges and put yourself in this local context or in that context that you're in. So I think it's a journey, and that's actually something I would put a little exclamation point around. It is a journey, because I'm constantly learning. I think everybody else is too.
Yeah. Now, the easiest thing after this hour, and you say it like it's a journey, the easiest thing for everybody would be, okay, Thandi, after an hour, I'm now an ally. How do I go out and practice this? Okay, because we all want those solutions. And I sometimes have clients who are like, okay, we just want this fixed, Helene. We want more women in leadership. We want more diversity in form of ethnicity and so forth. And we're okay with you being a member of the LGBT community. And even when they just say that sentence, I'm like, we got to work on something if you have to say that you're okay with being a member of the LGBT community. But I agree that it's a learning journey, and we sometimes say that it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back with working with diversity and inclusion. And it is in that 1 step back that you actually learn something that you're then able to apply in the next 2 steps that you take. But as businesses and organization, we just want a quick fix. We want to execute. We want to move forward. There's a lot of tempo. Digitalization is putting even more speed into our decision making. If you should do one thing after this talk, what is the first thing that you actually do in order to practice allyship?
Well, I think it's about telling yourself that step backwards, it's okay, you know, and there is actually, and I know that it's super annoying, but there is no quick fix for this, like you just said. But one thing that I always tell people is you have the power in your leadership position. You have the power to change something within your small sphere of influence. So if you can somehow muster the courage to look at yourself and what do you bring into this world? What do you bring into the workplace? How can you use your privilege? How can you become more aware of your biases? And it's about not taking it personal. It's a system that we are all a part of, and we all have biases. Biases is also something that makes us survive, and know that when you sit in front of a computer, you may have to turn it on to use it, stuff like that. But bias is also kind of it also hinders us in different things, in ways we see people, in the way we are socialized and stuff. So I would say the first step is to acknowledge that this is a personal journey that you need to take, and your whatever work environment you are in, it comes after. Of course, there's steps you can take as a, you know, if you work with talent acquisition or whatever, that you know, but I think in reality, it's about the personal steps you take towards becoming an ally, and seeing it as an active thing.
Okay, so here's actually a great jumping point over to the next thing I wanted to talk about. Why this is so challenging, especially for the majority, or the majority of any. And again, we're talking about different contexts. You are a majority in South Africa, and you have more privileges there than you do here, and so forth. So again, dear listeners, it moves. It's complex, it changes wherever context you're in. But what I often find is that the people really want to be allies, especially if they're connected to this journey. But they're like, oh, when they then actually have to go into it and actually have to do it, they're like, no, 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 no. This is uncomfortable. I do not like this. I have to be a killjoy. We sometimes talk about me in my personal life being that feministic killjoy. I ruin every Saturday night when there's drinks. I ruin every Friday bar with my friends. I'm like, that's me too. That's Black Lives Matters. That's, oh my God, did you ever know what Stonewall is? Everybody is sick and tired of me. And it's exhausting also sometimes for myself. But you talk about that really, really hard look in the mirror. That's where the journey starts. That's where the personal journey starts. Why do you think? I know why it's uncomfortable, but I want to hear from you. Why do you think it's so hard? What is it that you face, for example, when you're in South Africa, standing there with your privileges? And why is it so hard to take that look in the mirror?
Well, because essentially it's about your, you know, your personal privileges, and no, I mean, I think it's hard for everyone to look, like really deeply look within yourself. What have I earned because of, you know, merits or whatever? Not because we have to, meritocracy is also a whole different subject, but also what have I just earned because of where I come from or what university I went to. So it's about really looking at, I mean, did I earn this by myself, or is it because the system kind of raises this up as being a positive asset in society? And I think when we start looking at our own privilege, it kind of it doesn't feel good, you know. And even I think we came up with this kind of this term in, you know, Europeans versus sub-Saharan Africa. It's like this Euro guilt, you know. You come home and, like, even with Corona, I could just say, hey, bye, I'm leaving now, I'm going home to my safe apartment in Copenhagen with, you know, with our health systems and stuff like that. We do it, it's hard because the world is not designed to be equal, and by looking at our privileges, we can so easily see what it is that's wrong with the world. But that also means giving up privilege, and maybe that's the hardest thing of all, but it's the only way forward, you know. But I think that's why it's such an unpleasant thing sometimes to kind of engage in this journey called allyship. Yeah.
How do you give up a privilege?
Well, I can give you an example on what I actually did when I was CEO of a small business in Johannesburg. We worked with entrepreneurs, and I think I immediately kind of looked at myself and say, hey, why am I here? What's my role in this space? Why did they pick me to steer the journey of this organization? And I was like, well, one is, of course, I have, my credibility. I have experience in the matter. I have led this kind of organization before, blah, blah, blah. But also, how can I create agency for the people around me? Because I was coming from building up the ecosystem of social entrepreneurs in the Nordics, and suddenly I had to do it in South Africa. And I knew, okay, I don't know everything about this. I'm not the expert. My team is the experts, right? So how can I actually say, after 3 months, who would be who would be the next CEO of this place? How can I empower a person who knows who is super great? How can I empower that person to become the next me or whatever? And let's create a real journey for that goal. And I think it's about really creating these opportunities for people who might not have it just by being them, even though they might have a degree or whatever. It's about, again, looking at your privileges and how can you use that power you have to open doors for others. And I think this agency part is a very, well, it means you're not in the center all the time, which is fine for me, but I think it's not easy for all. But yeah, creating agency, it's super important.
But, and again, you say not being in the center all the time. Personally, I will admit, I will face the mirror right now, and I do like being the center of attention. Jesus Christ, I lab talks where I look at myself at a screen talking to other people. I'm like, who am I looking at? Am I looking at myself, or am I looking at you, Thandi? And I think that is okay. And I think that is fair to say that, yes, if you do like it, but you have to acknowledge that when you work, and that doesn't just go for allyship, that goes for leadership just entirely, that it's your job to give away power. It's your job to give away status. It's your job to give away privileges and lift other people up. No matter who they are and so forth. So we can call it leadership or we can call it allyship. But when we talk about allyship in particular and giving away privileges or giving agency to other, one thing I think sometimes that is missing, but that is missing so often in the D&I conversation, is the intersectionality. So could we just do a quick tour around that intersectionality? So I know what intersectionality is, but I'm passing on the mic now. So could you please give our listeners what is intersectionality? How do you use allyship intersectional?
Well, I think to truly understand how to be an ally, like you say, it's really also about understanding the complexities around marginalization or oppression or whatever it is. So we have to take intersectionality into consideration. And it's really about the acknowledgement that everyone in this room, we all have our unique experiences of discrimination or oppression. And we must consider all of these aspects when we can kind of shape this picture or perception of a group of people or identities. And that can be with gender or race or class, sexual orientation, physical abilities, accents, marital stages, all of these different, you can put on this intersection glasses and it's like the list will be long, of what intersections there might be and in what, in what social context you are then in the position of power or where you're marginalized. So I think intersection is really the key also to understanding this whole topic.
Yeah. And that, again, that goes because when I hear the term allyship coming about, and I think where it's very easy for the majority to kind of lash onto it, it's okay, then I'm an ally for my gay friend. Okay, then I'm an ally for my black friend. Okay, then I'm an ally for the friend I know who's sitting in a wheelchair. And I'm like, that's all fair and well and good. However, you have to see if there's a difference between, for example, your white friend who potentially has a mental disability, who's in an age group, who doesn't really belong where you kind of promote to leadership, and is also an introvert. That could actually also be a person with less status and less privileges. And also, if you, for example, throw on a bisexuality to a woman of color, with then also further in an age group, then you're kind of blowing up the parameters of intersections where you can be marginalized and can be oppressed.
Yeah.
Navigating that wheel constantly is crucial.
It is. And I think also, like you talked about earlier, that allyship for me is also very much just a leadership perspective. It's something that we need to consider much more in this realm of leadership and not like this activist space, which is also why I said in the beginning that a lot of people think allyship is this activist thing, but it's not. It's really about leadership, and it's at the core of leadership. And I think for me, for example, working for a leadership organization like the BMW Foundation, one of the conversations we often have is like, oh, when we enter these networks, it's usually designed for extroverts, for example. How do we really accommodate introverts who has just as much to say, but they just do it in a different way than extroverts? And also when we were designing this EDB week, where we kind of hosted conversation of all of these intersections of the landscape of diversity, how do we really accommodate and understand and give voices or give platforms to all these different intersections that might be hard to see, like mental illness or whatever it might be.
One of the things we also discuss when we talk about inclusive leadership and diversity factor is curiosity. I have a lot of leaders coming up to me and then they say, how do I handle what's going on with that whole gender sexuality thing? I heard that there's more than 2 genders, and then they stand there with big eyes, like caught in the headlights, like, more than 2 genders. I don't get it, Helene. And then we're like, and how do I deal with this? How do I deal with this 2 to 3 years down the road? And I'm like, try just to be curious. Try just to be in a position of curiosity where you're like, okay, that's exciting. I don't understand, but teach me more. And I think that is a key parameter in allyship also, because I sometimes have people coming up to me and say, how do I become an ally, for example, of the gay community or the LGBTQ plus community? And I'm like, do you know what Stonewall is? And they're like, no, what's Stonewall? And I'm like, go see a documentary on Stonewall, or go to Wikipedia and read up on Stonewall. What was it actually that happened in New York back in the day on Stonewall? Why is it that there is a Stonewall Foundation? And why is it that is something that we use during the Pride and so forth? So just that curiosity. But I think sometimes, and I know this from myself also, when I'm a white woman in a room with people of color, and I'm the only white woman in a room with people of color, every white woman should have to go to a room where they're a minority. I have to say to you, this is a way to get ears and learn. But how, and one of the things I remember from being in working with anti-racism, and thereby for being in a room where I had to really remember that I had 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason and listen, is that uncomfortable feeling, because you get to sense, okay, shit, I'm a minority right now just because of my skin color. But the thing about me is that when I go out of this room, I get my privileges back straight away. You still have to go out in the world as marginalized with your skin color. And what I found often is, how do you actually act or interact or engage with curiosity? Because what I think sometimes the majority is really afraid of is stepping over somebody's toes. They're afraid of how to actually ask that question with curiosity. They're afraid to actually engage in that context. They're afraid of being political incorrect, is what I often hear. So how would be the best way to approach that from your lived experience, being a woman of color, being marginalized here in Denmark, but not a privileged position in South Africa? How would that be? How do you engage with you from a perspective of curiosity?
Well, I always tend to say to people, I mean, besides being curious, it's also about really reflecting on, where do you get your knowledge? Why don't you start really taking an interest in trying to open up your perspectives on the world? You know, read literature, like go through your bookshelf, for example. Everybody here can go through their bookshelf when we're done with this call. How many books do you have that is written by you know, queer people or Black people or whatever it might be. I mean, how can we start opening our minds and being curious around the knowledge that we have? And also, I think if we really want to be, taking this role on allyship, it's also about respect. It's about respecting that other people have different lived experiences than ourselves, and we can, with respect and curiosity, ask almost any question. You know, it's not about, of course, we can step wrongly, but if we do it with respect for the person that's, you know, and really believe their stories, you know, not you know, grab after other, you know, challenges. Well, what about this one, or what, you know, what about that, or are you sure that's how you really felt? Are you sure you you know, felt racism or whatever it might be? I think it's about really respecting and trusting that the person you are standing in front of is telling you the truth, you know, that their lived experience is their truth. So I think it's about respect. It's really about respect. And I think also it's about being patient with yourself, being patient and saying, okay, if Thandi here, she goes out the door every day and live a marginalized life in Copenhagen or whatever, then I can also be in this uncomfortableness sometimes, you know. And like you said, Helena, I think it's also super important on trying to put yourself in positions where you're not the majority, for example. So you can really feel, what does it mean to having to open your mouth or navigate a language that you're not used to? And I mean language with, you know, culture or whatever. So I think it's really about challenging your perceptions and your knowledge and your basis of knowledge.
I totally agree with that. And that leads me to what can you say? The part about allyship that I feel doesn't get a lot of attention. We talk a lot about what it is allyship is. Okay, take on the struggle as your own, or examine your own privileges and so forth, and try to be curious. And it goes back to leadership. And I totally agree with that respect, that is fundamental. Acknowledging when people come to you with a feeling of being offended, either because of their sexuality, their gender, their race. Hold that space and hold that feeling and listen. Just, Jesus Christ, you don't have to play devil's advocate. You don't have to say, are you really, really sure you felt that way? Yeah, I'm kind of sure. So totally agree, hold the space. But what I don't think we talk a lot about when we talk about allyship, because, and of course, that is also important that we get that proactive agency installed, especially with those who have privileges in the context in which they have status, is how long is the minority supposed to wait before something actually happens? You know what I mean? Again, this is a learning journey, but okay, if we are to reach the SDGs and so forth, we need to power this conversation. And sometimes I feel like the minority, whether it's age, whether it's race, whether it's sexuality, whether it's gender and so forth, can spend a really, really long time being told, be patient, it will happen. And I'm like, I run a consultancy where I often have to advise a senior management team, a C-level team, compromised of white, heterosexual men aged 45, 50 or something like that. And sometimes I'm like, enough with the white dudes, right? And I'm like, enough with change, transformation, positive, proactive change work and so forth. I'm throwing you all under the bus. I'm done with being patient. Go do something. Pass the mic, lose your privileges. Even better, step down and give somebody else. So how long do we have to be patient? How long does the minority actually be patient?
Well, I think as a minority in Denmark, at least, I think I do have to be patient still. I don't want to be, but I think if I'm not actively doing something to push this agenda, nobody's going to do it for me. I mean, until, and I think we also spoke about this at some point, Helena, that especially maybe in Europe and in the Nordics, we have still yet to kind of understand the profound missing link between the really fantastic assets of diversity and why it's important to give the floor to new kind of communities and let the ship be led by somebody else than the white male heterosexual whatever. But before there's a connect between, for example, that, oh, it's actually good for business, oh, it's actually good for working culture, that everybody feels like they can be part of the conversation or go to work and not feel they have to code switch or hide themselves or whatever. I think until that link is made, and I think we see it in some parts of the world like the US, it's very much like everybody's hiring for DEI professionals now because they know with Black Lives Matter and with the Me Too movement, we can't not do it, you know? But until such a switch, this little missing link is not in the Nordics, for example, I will still have to push for this agenda and lead the way, even though I'm impatient. So yeah, there's nothing else that we can do, but also form alliances. Talk to you. We need to talk more together. You know, how can we push this agenda together? And I think that's also why I've been co-founding these different initiatives on how we can come together and be a stronger force in numbers.
Yeah, and I get that, and I totally agree with that. But that is a mental load beyond, isn't it? Because not only do you have to do your everyday work, like everybody else probably has to do on their call, whether or not they're entrepreneurs or they work in a big corporate company or they're solo freelancers or whatever it is they do. Still have to do our work. Some of us has kids that we have to pick up. We have to shop for groceries. Something has to be cleaned. I have a dog lying over here that I need to walk also. His name is Batman. So there's a lot of load that we just have going on. And now you say, okay, I'm going to be patient and I'm going to take on the mental load also of trying to push this conversation forward as a minority. I would be tired, Thandi.
Oh yeah, it gets tiring sometimes. You know, I'm also a mother of kids, and actually I really love that your dog's name is Batman. My youngest son would totally go nuts about that. But I think it's also a personality thing. I mean, I have a very kind of strong sense of equality, and I think it comes from the fact that my father was a refugee from the apartheid system that was maybe one of the most unequitable systems implemented in any society in South Africa back in the day. But I really feel so strongly about this topic, and I can't see a world where my kids would have to have the same experiences as me. I have to do something regardless of how tiring it is. But I also use my home, my base, my husband, my friends to offload and like, you know, swear, what the hell, you know. But when I'm out in the world, I really feel an urge to make a change. And I think it's okay for some minorities that don't want to be in that position. But I think if I can muster the energy, then I have to do it, you know, even though it is super draining, also emotionally.
And isn't that one of the things actually that you also have to learn when you start to engage with allyship, especially if you are a very privileged person who holds a lot of status in that society in which you engage, is that this is mentally draining sometimes and it's triggering, and you probably get some experiences up that you didn't know that you actually had, that with new glasses you kind of faced, and where you're like, oh shit.
Oh shit. Yeah, exactly.
We talk about sometimes in diversity factor that we want a therapist attached to the company, because not only are we working with this professionally, we also kill joys in our personal life. Some of us have different intersections of diversity, so it's like, okay, you do this, I do that, and then you sit every Saturday evening and then you have the conversation again, and then you have to speak to a client on Monday again about this, and it's like, somebody give me 1 year of vacation before I have to go through this. And is that why people also sometimes drop out of this conversation? Because it's just too hard.
No, but it is. And I think, for example, with my relationship to my husband, who is a white, straight man from the, you know, Esbjerg, which is a small province or city in Denmark, who lived a super privileged life. His parents are still together. He has like a degree and he holds a senior management position, whatever. But I think what I really use him for now that I also opened his eyes around the world is not just the same place for us all. It's very different experiences we have moving through our lives, you know, that he's like, it's so annoying now that you opened my eyes because now I can't unsee the things that's going on in our workplaces within, you know, in every system that we have, the banking system, whatever. But he also acknowledges that he actually has a position that he can help me, you know, in our everyday lives. He would do, for example, in the banking system, for example, it's very common that women, and especially women of color, they don't have access to different services, or no, you can't have that loan for your partner, whatever it is. So he takes care of those things, even with some of those things where he knows that as a white male he can get further. You kind of part our daily jobs in that way, you know. And I think it's a very nice kind of, I can put that burden onto him and he will do what's right for all of us, you know. So it's about finding somebody who can understand your you know, journey and your intersections of marginalized lives and really help you in your day-to-day business, you know. So
yeah, and also have a place where you can unload, as you say.
It's very important.
Just being able, and I think that goes for whether you're a minority or you're an ally, trying to be an active ally, is that you find these spaces where it's okay to unload and say, oh my God, this is so hard. And because especially if you're an ally and if you do hold a lot of privilege as me, a white woman, who has a master's degree from Copenhagen Business School, lives on the right side of the tracks, have my own company. Jesus Christ, even though I have a lot of ass, also I have a lot of privilege. So being in a space where you're actually able to say as an ally, okay, this is really, really hard. I'm really, really tired now. There's a lot of mental load. I've been a feministic killjoy for the past 3 dinners I went to. Everybody hates me. And I still have to recognize that even though everybody now hates me, there's still people out there who faces an even bigger struggle than the one I have to go through. And I think that's where somebody is like, oh, I can't do this anymore. And then they lose momentum and then they don't go forward.
But I think that,
sorry.
Sorry to interrupt you. I think exactly that point about creating safe spaces for, you know, I think even white people, for example, they have a hard time giving themselves a space, for example, with other white people where they can, you know, if they're all allies, let's do a infinity group where we can talk about how hard it is to be in this particular space. And the same thing with, I also have Black women leadership groups where I talk about things that I can't talk about with other people. And I think it's really, really essential and necessary to create these spaces in our own lives, but also in our working environment. You know, how can we create conversations, deep listening, unloading, where it's okay to be you, where it's okay to be the queer person, or it's okay to be whatever it is that your identity is. Supporting that, supporting those platforms where we can actually just be ourselves and unload. That's super important for this journey.
And for companies sitting here on this call, we often call them employee resources groups in your organization. And it's a great listening tool also for any organization to have employee resources groups, whether it's for persons of color, the queer community, women in leadership. I know women are not a minority as such, but in leadership positions, they're marginalized. Or for example, people with disabilities. Create these safe spaces within your organization. And then if you're really good, have a D&I council or something similar that they can actually share their knowledge and share their experience with, so that your council working with diversity and inclusion, who is not just the HR ladies, but the entire businesses leaders, they can actually know what's going on for these marginalized groups and design initiatives and actions based on that. So not only does it work as a safe space for these people where they can unload, it can actually also be a great listening tool for your organization to design a more inclusive workspace. Totally
And I
agree.
think it's in that kind of sentiment, I think it's also very important to recognize that, you know, even though it seems hard, like, oh, I have to point out that these women of color in my business, for example, they are women of color, you know. But I think for us, for me as a woman of color, I am a woman of color and I embrace that identity very much. So don't ever be scared of dividing people into these different, I mean, in a perfect world, we don't have to talk about intersectionality, but we don't live in a perfect world. So I think it's super important to acknowledge that certain people go through certain things, and it's okay to create kind of a governance system where they can actually have these platforms by themselves, where they don't have to code switch. And yeah, like you said, Helene, it's actually a very nice tool to listen into what's going on with your employees and in the work culture overall.
Yeah. And isn't that the true basis of allyship actually, is to recognize that it's okay to see people's identity. It's okay to see their race, to see their sexuality, to see their age, to see their gender, and so forth. That is not discriminatory. I know for some people that it may seem odd because 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we were told not to see color. That was the worst thing we could do, was to see color. And now 30 years down the line, it's like, look at my color. But that is kind of the true allyship thing, is to see that some intersections have more status / privileges than other, depending on the context and socialization that you're in. And we have 2 minutes left, and normally I don't use all of them, so jump in with questions if you have anything. But I wanted to ask you, we're supposed to reach the SDGs on gender equality and inequality just overall in society. What was it, within 10, what is it, by
8 years.
8 years, yeah, 2030. How are we going to do that?
I think we need more of these spaces where we talk openly about what's missing in this fight. I mean, if we talk about now I think, for example, Nordic businesses, they have finally embraced the sustainability talk, right? How do we create sustainable supply chains? Oh, blah, blah, blah. But now we need to take that and put it into you know, like this intersectional lens with justice. What does it mean from a justice perspective? We can't just make solutions that are not equitable for the people who are in our supply chain, and then our CO2, you know, the math looks great. We need to kind of look at it more holistically. And I really think by applying these DI lenses on our different working areas, that's what's going to help us in the end. That's how we reach the goals, in my perspective.
Yeah. What's the first thing the participants should go out and do after this call in terms of allyship?
I think they should, actually, I want to send them a little list. Well, I think you send out something to all of them.
Yes, there's a list. You have a list. We love lists because lists.
I have a list.
Everything check, we
Yeah.
love.
Great. So I have this little checklist on how to become an ally. And I also have another list that kind of, you know, combines some different subjects that you can go out and be smarter about. You can go out and read about it. So whenever Helene sends this after D&I Lab, whatever email, we will include these two lists. And I think, like I also said, maybe what I would do was try and look at yourself in where do you want to see the changes in your workplace? Is it within your personal lives? I would go out and find new friends, find conversation starters where you normally don't do it, you know, read different things, go, like I said, to your bookshelf and look, do I really have, is it the same type of authors I read? It's about opening our minds slowly and understanding the different realities that are out there, you know. But yeah, looking at our own privileges and seeing how that kind of how it shapes the way we are in the world. I think that's really a first step, acknowledging that it's you as a person who has to change. We are the ones who fill up the departments in different organizations, so we are actually the change makers, you know.
Do you think we will succeed in our lifetime? You and I, we're similar, the same age. We have kids similar in the same age, and it's no I don't think it's no secret that my son is a big driving force in this, because I want him to grow up in a different world. I want him to have other possibilities. Also, if he's if he's a cis man, if he's a straight man, if he's a gay man, whatever he will turn out to be, I want him to live in a different world than I grew up in, and also a world, and that's probably also something that we need to discuss sometimes, as allies towards men, that they don't have to fit into the box of the stereotypical white man, that there is other possibilities also. But I also, and I discussed this with my team in Diversity Factor a lot, is that I don't think I will be able to see it. I don't think that change will happen that soon. And maybe it's because I'm a pessimist. My dad brought me up that way. That way you don't get disappointed. You can only be happily surprised. But what do you think? Do you think we will achieve it?
I'm hopeful, I would say. I think we have come a long way with just having some conversation and actually having an audience that will listen to it, you know? And while we try and be better role models for our kids, I also have 2 sons, and what my wish for them is definitely to be able to embrace all of manhood with its emotions and crying, whatever it is, you know, and also being better towards women in general. I do think I am hopeful. We didn't, when I grew up, I'm 44. When I grew up, we didn't have conversations like this. Nobody ever acknowledged that we lived in a racist society, for example, and now there's cracks in the matrix. I think the pandemic, even if we can look at the pandemic as a gift of opening up new ways of looking at the world and new voices that has kind of that we can hear all of a sudden. They've always been there, but we suddenly hear them. That's a huge step for me, and that means for me that we also then have a chance of maybe not by 2030. We'll probably have some new development goals by that time, but at least we are on the right path.
Yeah. It's not Corona, I promise. I just got something wrong in my throat. Thank you, Thandi, for that. And thank you for leaving us with hope. I don't see any questions in the chat. So I'm actually, here we go. We have recently established a D&I council in our company. As you mentioned, the topic is a learning journey, very complex. Do you have examples of how companies measure progress that goes beyond employed men, women ratio? It's Ricardo who's asking to everybody. We often say and I will give the mic to Thandi just in how you would measure, but instead of measuring just on representation, for example, now there is different legal requirements in some companies that you can measure on. In Denmark, you can only measure representation on gender and age. There is a thing called the Second World War where we have a bit of a hard time measuring on ethnicity and other parameters that kind of makes our social context a bit scared of that, compared to the US, where it's much more normal to measure on race, ethnicity, and so forth, and religion. That's a different legislation. But measure on your inclusion level. Measure your culture. Try to ask the daring questions to your employees, how they perceive your culture. Is it equal? Is it inclusive? Do they feel safe? Is there actually psychological safety? We do those. It's a qualitative and quantitative analysis of a company, and you can do it yearly. You can do it through pulse surveys. We even give you a grade from 1 to 5, where 5 is the best and 1 is really, really poor, and we really have to do a lot of work with you. But that is a way to kind of get the temperature also going within your company, to actually find out if this is something that your employees perceive as a great company. So instead of doing that engagement survey where you ask them whether or not they understand the strategy, try having the guts to ask them whether they actually feel included in your company. Thandi, what do you do within your consultancy? How do you measure?
I agree very much. It's not about strategy or how, you know, the service that we normally do. It's around asking towards the culture, as you say. So my advice is the same, but also how, you know, is the DI council, is it within a leadership position where they can actually make decisions. I think that's super important. It's about if something you can also measure, for example, if the DI Council had an idea around some sort of implementation or whatever it might be, did it actually happen? Do they have the buy-in to do stuff that matters, that they know, you know? But definitely the qualitative questions around, do they feel good at work? Do they feel like they can come to work as their entire beings, or do they have to become a completely different person? You know, designing questions like that, and also, yeah, listening, do the listening formats where the DI Council can actually listen to employees and stuff. That would be also the way that I would measure.
Yeah. And give D&I responsibles in your organization a budget. Give them money.
Yes, please. Oh, for God's sake, give them money.
Figurehead. And I noticed 2 consultants sitting here saying that to you. So feel it with shame. But yes, if you are to move this journey forward, you need people working on it, but you also need a budget. Otherwise, if there's no money in it, you're not committed. I'm going to send you off. We have 1 minute left, so I'm going to respect your time. I will send out the recording to everybody after the weekend, including Thandi's lists of how to be a great ally and how to move this conversation forward. I want to thank you all for joining this call. And I especially want to thank you, Thandi, for giving such great advice and for being so straightforward and honest with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Helene. And thank you everyone for joining today. It's been a real pleasure.
Have a great weekend, everybody, once you get there, and so long. Thank you.